Haunted house horror, the ghostly child's terrifying tale. It all started when we moved into that old, creaky house at the end of Maple Street. The kind of house that sits under a perpetual shadow, no matter how bright the sun shines. My wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Lily, were excited about the new start. I, however, couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to the place like a shroud. The first night was restless. The wind howled, and the house seemed to groan under the weight of its secrets. We unpacked what we could and collapsed into bed, hoping for a fresh start the next day. But it wasn't long before I heard it, a faint giggle, like that of a child. I shot up in bed, heart pounding, but there was only silence. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind. The next morning, as we explored the house, Lily ran into what would be her new room. She was enchanted by the large bay window overlooking the overgrown garden. Sarah and I were unpacking when we heard Lily talking to someone. Assuming she was playing with her toys, we paid no mind. But as the day went on, the sound of her conversation grew eerily clear, and we realized she was talking to an imaginary friend. Every time I asked, she'd simply say, "It's just Timmy, Daddy." As the days turned into weeks, strange occurrences became commonplace. Footsteps echoed in the hallways at night, and doors creaked open on their own. Sarah tried to rationalize it, saying it was an old house with old noises. But there was something sinister in the air that logic couldn't explain. One night, as I was working late in my study, I heard Lily's laughter echo through the halls. It was past her bedtime, and I found her room empty. Panic surged through me, and I rushed down the dark corridor. The laughter led me to the basement, a place we hadn't ventured into yet. The door was ajar, and the cold air that seeped out felt like 1,000 icy fingers brushing against my skin. As I descended the stairs, the laughter stopped abruptly. The basement was a cluttered mess of old furniture and forgotten relics. In the dim light, I saw a small, dusty rocking horse in the corner, slowly rocking back and forth. My breath caught in my throat when I noticed Lily standing beside it, staring at something unseen. "Lily, what are you doing down here?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Playing with Timmy," she replied, her voice unnervingly calm. "He wants to show me his toys." Before I could respond, the basement door slammed shut behind me, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, but it was dead. The air grew colder, and I could hear the faint sound of a child's giggle, but it was different this time, closer, more menacing. I scooped Lily into my arms and bolted up the stairs, the darkness pressing against us like a living entity. When we finally reached the top, the door swung open as if by an unseen force, and we stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt alive, watching, waiting. And deep down, I knew we were not alone. Something, or someone, wanted to play, and it wouldn't stop until it got what it desired. The next day, I decided to do some research about the house's history. What I found chilled me to the bone. Decades ago, a young boy named Timothy had lived here. He had died under mysterious circumstances, his body found at the bottom of the basement stairs. The official cause of death was an accident, but whispers in the town spoke of something far darker. As I read through the old newspaper clippings, a sense of dread settled over me. Timothy's spirit was still in the house, seeking a new playmate. And it had chosen Lily. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the giggle again, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps. My blood ran cold. This was only the beginning. The house had awakened, and it wouldn't rest until it dragged us into its ghostly games. Sleep became a distant memory. Every night, the giggles and footsteps grew louder, more insistent. The house felt like a predator, watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I could see the fear growing in Sarah's eyes, but we tried to keep things as normal as possible for Lily. Yet, her imaginary friend Timmy seemed to consume her every waking moment. One evening, Sarah and I decided to confront the issue head-on. We sat Lily down in the living room, the flickering fireplace casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Lily, sweetheart," Sarah began gently, "we need to talk about Timmy. Can you tell us more about him?" Lily looked up from her coloring book, her expression oddly serene. "He's my friend. He likes to play games with me." "What kind of games?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hide and seek, mostly," she replied, her eyes drifting towards the darkened hallway. "He says he's lonely and wants me to stay with him forever." A chill ran down my spine. "Lily, Timmy isn't real. He's just a figment of your imagination." Lily's face twisted in confusion and then defiance. "He's real, Daddy. He's standing right there." She pointed to the corner of the room, and I swear I saw the shadows shift, like something was moving just out of sight. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As I lay in bed, I heard Sarah whispering, her voice trembling with fear. "I saw him, Jack. A little boy in old-fashioned clothes, just standing at the foot of our bed." I pulled her close, trying to offer some comfort, but I knew we couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. The house was haunted, and whatever was here wanted our daughter. The next day, I decided to contact a local historian, Mrs. Thompson, who had lived in the town her whole life. She welcomed me into her cozy, cluttered home, and as we sipped tea, she recounted the tragic history of our house. "Timothy was a lonely child," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "His parents were distant, and he spent most of his time alone. One day, he fell down the basement stairs and broke his neck. It was a terrible accident, or so they say." "Do you believe it was an accident?" I asked, my heart pounding. Mrs. Thompson's eyes darkened. "There were rumors, whispers that something evil lurked in that house. Timothy's parents moved away shortly after his death, and the house has changed hands many times since. No one stays for long." As I left her house, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town. I felt a renewed sense of dread. We had to leave that house, but how could we convince Lily to abandon her new friend? That night, I decided to set up a camera in the basement. I needed proof of what was happening. As I descended the stairs, the air grew thick with a sense of foreboding. I placed the camera on a shelf, ensuring it had a clear view of the room, and quickly made my way back upstairs. Hours later, as Sarah and I huddled around the laptop, the footage played back in eerie silence. For a while, there was nothing. Then, the rocking horse began to move on its own, slowly at first, then faster. And then, a small figure appeared, a translucent boy in old-fashioned clothes, his eyes dark voids. He looked directly at the camera, and a sinister smile spread across his face. "Come play with me," he whispered, his voice barely audible but unmistakable. Sarah gasped, and I felt my blood run cold. There was no denying it now. Timothy's ghost was real, and he wanted our daughter. As the night wore on, the house grew restless. The laughter, the footsteps, the shadows, they were everywhere. We were trapped in a nightmare with no escape. And deep down, I knew Timothy wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from Lily's room. We bolted up the stairs, hearts pounding. Her room was empty, but her window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the cold night air. My heart raced as I saw small footprints leading out into the garden. "Lily!" I shouted, but the only response was a distant, childlike giggle. We grabbed flashlights and rushed outside, the beams cutting through the darkness. The footprints led us to the edge of the woods behind our house, where the air grew colder, almost suffocatingly so. "Lily, where are you?" Sarah called, her voice breaking. And then we saw her, standing by an old, crumbling well, her back to us. As we approached, she turned slowly, her eyes vacant, her lips moving in silent conversation. "Timmy wants to show me something," she said, her voice hollow. Before we could react, a shadowy figure materialized beside her, its hand resting on her shoulder. Timothy's ghostly face twisted into a malevolent grin, and in that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't just seeking a playmate, he was looking for a replacement. A chill ran through me as I watched Lily stand there, her eyes devoid of any emotion. Timothy's ghostly figure loomed over her, casting an unnatural shadow on the ground. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened, and I could feel her fear mirroring my own. "Lily, step away from the well," I commanded, my voice trembling. But she didn't move. Instead, Timothy's grin widened, and he spoke in a voice that was a mix of childlike innocence and sinister intent. "She likes it here. We're having fun." My heart raced as I took a step forward. "Lily, please, come to us." Lily turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto mine. "He says he wants to show me his favorite place." Before we could react, Lily took a step towards the well's edge. Panic surged through me, and I lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her back just as her foot slipped. The ground gave way slightly, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought we would both fall in. Timothy's laughter echoed around us, and the temperature plummeted. "You can't take her away," he hissed. "She's mine now." I pulled Lily into my arms, and Sarah and I backed away from the well. Timothy's figure flickered, his eyes burning with an unnatural light. "This isn't over," he whispered, before dissolving into the shadows. Back inside the house, we bolted the doors and huddled in the living room, the fear palpable in the air. Lily seemed to come back to herself, her eyes regaining their usual spark. "Daddy, Mommy, what happened? Why were we outside?" Sarah and I exchanged worried glances. "You were sleepwalking, sweetie," Sarah said gently. "But you're safe now." Lily nodded, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. We needed help, and fast. I reached out to a paranormal investigator named Dr. Emily Harris, who had a reputation for dealing with hauntings like ours. When I explained our situation, she agreed to come the next day. Dr. Harris arrived with an air of quiet authority. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an aura of calm that immediately made us feel better. She set up various pieces of equipment around the house, cameras, audio recorders, and strange devices that hummed with energy. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," she said, her voice steady. "Timothy's spirit is trapped here, but there's something more malevolent at play." As night fell, the atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation. Dr. Harris sat with us in the living room, her eyes scanning the room as if seeing things we couldn't. "Timothy is a lost soul," she explained. "He needs to move on, but something is keeping him here." Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the lights flickered. The sound of faint giggling echoed through the halls. Dr. Harris stood, her expression serious. "He's here." We followed her to the basement, where the air was frigid and thick with an oppressive presence. The rocking horse moved on its own, and Timothy's figure appeared, more solid than ever before. "Timothy," Dr. Harris called out, her voice calm but firm. "Why are you here? What do you want?" Timothy's eyes flickered with something close to sorrow. "I'm lonely. I want to play." Dr. Harris nodded. "I understand, but you can't take Lily. She belongs with her family. You need to move on." Timothy's expression twisted with anger. "No. She stays with me." The room seemed to vibrate with his rage, and the lights flickered wildly. Suddenly, an unseen force slammed into Dr. Harris, knocking her to the ground. The shadowy figure of Timothy loomed over her, and for a moment, I saw something else, a darker, more malevolent presence intertwined with his spirit. "We need to break the connection," Dr. Harris gasped, struggling to her feet. "It's feeding off his loneliness and anger." Sarah and I rushed to help her, our fear pushing us forward. "How do we do that?" I asked, desperation in my voice. Dr. Harris looked at us with determination. "We need to confront the darkness and show Timothy the light. He needs to remember who he was before the darkness took over." We gathered around Timothy's ghostly form, our fear giving way to a fierce resolve. "Timothy," I said, my voice strong, "you were a happy boy once. You had dreams and a life. Remember who you were." Timothy's figure wavered, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the boy he once was. But the darkness surged, pulling him back. "No!" he screamed, his voice filled with pain and anger. Dr. Harris raised her hands, a soft glow emanating from them. "Timothy, let go of the anger. Let go of the darkness." The room filled with a blinding light, and Timothy's form began to dissolve. The darkness shrieked in rage, but the light grew stronger, pushing it back. With a final, heart-wrenching cry, Timothy disappeared, and the house fell silent. We stood there, breathing heavily, the tension slowly draining from our bodies. Dr. Harris looked at us, her eyes filled with exhaustion and relief. "It's over. He's free." But as we made our way back upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. The house felt different, but not entirely free of its haunting presence. I knew deep down that this was not the end. Timothy might be gone, but the darkness that had held him captive was still there, waiting. Despite Dr. Harris's assurance, the house remained steeped in an unsettling quiet. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the darkness to return. We tried to get back to our routine, but the memory of Timothy's tormented spirit lingered like a shadow over everything we did. One evening, about a week after Dr. Harris's visit, Sarah and I decided to put Lily to bed early. She had been unusually quiet since that night, her once bright and lively demeanor now replaced with a somber silence. We read her a bedtime story, tucked her in, and kissed her goodnight. As we closed her bedroom door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. That night, I was jolted awake by a low, guttural whisper. It wasn't the light-hearted giggle of Timothy, but something darker, more malevolent. I glanced at the clock, it was 3:33 a.m. The witching hour. I sat up, straining to hear the noise again. The whisper grew louder, and I realized it was coming from Lily's room. Heart pounding, I rushed down the hallway, Sarah close behind. We burst into Lily's room to find her sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to twist and writhe as if they had a life of their own. "Daddy, he's back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But he's not alone." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I flicked on the light, but the shadows didn't dissipate. Instead, they seemed to grow darker, more defined. Sarah grabbed Lily, and we backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. As we huddled together in the living room, the whispers continued to echo through the house. It felt like we were being surrounded, the darkness closing in from all sides. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into complete darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight I had left on the coffee table and switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Come play with us," they chanted, over and over. Sarah clung to Lily, her eyes wide with fear. "What do they want?" she cried. "They want us," I replied, my voice shaking. "They want to drag us into their world." Just then, the basement door creaked open, and a cold draft swept through the room. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I saw the outline of several figures standing at the top of the stairs, children, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted with malice. "Come play with us," they whispered again, their voices blending into a haunting chorus. I grabbed Sarah and Lily, and we stumbled out of the house, the whispers chasing us into the night. We didn't stop until we reached the car, slamming the doors shut and locking them. As we sped away, I glanced back at the house. The windows glowed with an eerie light, and I could see the figures watching us, their eyes burning with a malevolent hunger. We drove to a nearby hotel and checked in, desperate for a place to escape the darkness. As we sat in the small, dimly lit room, I tried to come up with a plan. We couldn't go back to the house, not while it was still under the grip of whatever malevolent force had taken hold. The next morning, I called Dr. Harris again. When I told her what had happened, she agreed to meet us at a nearby cafe. Her face was grave as she listened to our story. "I feared this might happen," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "The darkness that held Timothy is ancient and powerful. It's not just a spirit, it's something much worse." "What do we do?" I asked, feeling a sense of hopelessness creep in. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual," she replied. "But it's dangerous. If we're not careful, we could provoke the entity and make things worse." I nodded, determination replacing my fear. "We'll do whatever it takes." That evening, we returned to the house with Dr. Harris. She had brought an assortment of candles, herbs, and other tools for the ritual. As she set everything up, the house seemed to groan in protest, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. "We need to stay together," she instructed. "Whatever happens, do not break the circle." We held hands as Dr. Harris began the ritual, chanting in a language I didn't understand. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "Come play with us," they chanted, their voices filled with anger and desperation. The candles flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek, and I shuddered. "Stay strong," Dr. Harris urged. "We're almost there." Just then, a deafening roar filled the room, and the shadows surged towards us, their forms twisting and writhing. The circle of light around us flickered, and for a moment, I thought it would be consumed by the darkness. But Dr. Harris's chanting grew louder, more powerful, and the light began to push back against the shadows. With a final, bone-chilling scream, the shadows dissipated, and the room fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air grew warm again. We collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. "It's over," Dr. Harris said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The darkness is gone." But as we made our way back upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. The house felt different, but not entirely free of its haunting presence. I knew deep down that this was not the end. The entity might be gone, but the house had awakened, and it wasn't finished with us yet. The days following the final cleansing were marked by an uneasy calm. The house felt different, almost normal, but there was a lingering sense of anticipation, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting. Dr. Harris checked in regularly, assuring us that the entity was gone for good, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, the lights flickered once again. My heart skipped a beat, but then they steadied, and I tried to convince myself it was just a minor electrical glitch. We continued eating, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy for Lily's sake. After putting Lily to bed, Sarah and I sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fears. "Do you think it's really over?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to believe it is," I replied, "but I can't shake this feeling that something's still here." Just then, a loud crash echoed from the basement. We both jumped to our feet, our hearts pounding. Grabbing a flashlight, I motioned for Sarah to stay with Lily, and I made my way to the basement door. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in the beam of the flashlight. The basement was a mess, items strewn everywhere, as if something had torn through the room in a fit of rage. The rocking horse lay on its side, broken. I scanned the room, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw it, a faint, shadowy figure standing in the corner. It wasn't Timothy. It was something darker, more twisted. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and a deep, guttural voice filled the room. "You can't escape me," it hissed. "This house is mine." I backed away, fear gripping me. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "I want your daughter. She has the light I need. The boy was just a tool to lure her in." My blood ran cold. "You'll never have her," I spat, determination replacing my fear. The figure surged forward, its form twisting and expanding. "You can't stop me," it roared, its voice shaking the very foundations of the house. Just then, a brilliant light filled the room, and the figure recoiled, screaming in pain. Dr. Harris stood at the top of the stairs, her face set in grim determination. "You are not welcome here," she shouted, her voice filled with authority. She began to chant, the same ancient language she had used before, but this time, the light emanating from her was blinding. The figure writhed and screamed, its form dissolving in the brilliance. With a final, ear-splitting scream, the figure disintegrated, and the light faded. The basement fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting once again. Dr. Harris descended the stairs, her face pale but resolute. "It's over," she said, her voice filled with finality. "The entity is gone for good." I felt a surge of relief and exhaustion. "Thank you," I whispered, tears of gratitude welling in my eyes. As we made our way back upstairs, the house felt lighter, almost welcoming. Sarah and Lily were waiting, their faces filled with hope and relief. "It's really over?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Harris nodded. "Yes, it's really over. The house is free." We thanked Dr. Harris profusely, and she left, promising to check in on us in a few days. As we settled into bed that night, the house was quiet, and for the first time in months, I felt a genuine sense of peace. But just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a faint giggle, like the tinkling of a child's laughter. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up, straining to hear. The house was silent. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. I lay back down and closed my eyes, but the giggle echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had once plagued our home. As I drifted off to sleep, a single thought lingered: the house might be free, but some shadows never truly vanish.